Once hailed as liberators, some African leaders rose to power with promises of freedom, unity, and prosperity. But behind those promises came greed, fear, and absolute control. Ballots turned into bullets, and dreams were buried beneath the weight of dictatorship. From golden palaces built on stolen wealth to rivers stained with the blood of their own people, these rulers transformed hope into horror. This is not just history, it's a warning. These are the 12 African dictators who ruined their countries. At number 12, Joseph Kony, Uganda. In the jungles of northern Uganda, a name became synonymous with fear: Joseph Kony. He was never a president, never an elected leader, yet he ruled through terror greater than any government. As the self-proclaimed prophet of the Lord's Resistance Army, Kony claimed he was chosen by God to cleanse Uganda. But his holy mission became one of Africa's darkest nightmares. Over the years, his rebels abducted more than 60,000 children, forcing boys to become killers and girls to become slaves. Villages vanished overnight, burned, looted, erased. And while the world debated how to stop him, Kony moved through the forest like a ghost, leaving behind nothing but ash and silence. Even after his disappearance, the scars of his war remain: children who grew up too fast, families that never healed, and a generation forever haunted by his name. Joseph Kony was not a ruler by title, but a dictator by terror. At number 11, Jean Kambanda, Rwanda. In 1994, Rwanda descended into hell, and Jean Kambanda held the match. Appointed as prime minister during the height of the Rwandan genocide, he wasn't a man who lost control. He was the one giving the orders. Under his leadership, government radio stations called for the extermination of an entire people. Roadblocks were set up not to check IDs, but to execute anyone with the wrong one. In just 100 days, nearly 1 million Rwandans, mostly Tutsis, were slaughtered. Neighbors turned on neighbors, friends became killers, and the nation bled from within. Kambanda didn't just fail to stop it, he fueled it. His government supplied weapons, coordinated militias, and silenced anyone who spoke of peace. After the genocide, he was captured and became the first head of government in history convicted of genocide by an international tribunal. Kambanda's legacy is not one of leadership, but of betrayal, blood, and shame. A reminder that sometimes evil doesn't need an army, only authority. At number 10, Hissne Habr, Chad. In the scorching deserts of Chad, a man once praised as a patriot became one of Africa's most feared tyrants. Hissne Habr came to power in 1982, promising unity and stability. What followed instead was a reign of torture, silence, and unimaginable cruelty. His secret police, known as the DDS, Directorate of Documentation and Security, became instruments of terror. People disappeared in the night, never to be seen again. Torture chambers filled the capital, in N'Djamena, where electric shocks, suffocation, and sexual violence were used to crush dissent. By the end of his 8-year rule, an estimated 40,000 people have been killed, and hundreds of thousands more tortured or imprisoned. The fear was so deep that even whispers could cost a life. When he was finally overthrown in 1990, Habr fled with millions in stolen wealth, living comfortably in exile, until justice caught up with him. In 2016, he became the first African leader ever convicted of crimes against humanity by an African court. Habr's rule proved that tyranny doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it hides behind patriotism until the silence becomes unbearable. At number 9, Jean-Bdel Bokassa, Central African Republic. In the heart of Africa, one man crowned himself emperor while his people starved. Jean-Bdel Bokassa, a former French army officer, seized power in 1966, promising order and progress for the Central African Republic. But over the next decade, he transformed a poor nation into his personal kingdom, a place where fear replaced freedom. In 1977, he staged a coronation so lavish it cost over $20 million, nearly a third of the country's annual budget. Diamonds glittered, gold flowed, and hundreds of imported guests feasted, while children in the streets had nothing to eat. But his extravagance was only the surface. Beneath it lay horror, torture, executions, and even accusations of cannibalism. Those who spoke against him vanished. He ordered the massacre of school children protesting his regime's policies. When France finally grew tired of its former allies' madness, they orchestrated a coup while Bokassa was abroad. Soldiers found palaces filled with gold and dungeons filled with death. He died years later in obscurity, still calling himself Emperor Bokassa I, a man who built a throne out of bones and left behind a nation struggling to rebuild its soul. At number 8, Sani Abacha, Nigeria. Nigeria has seen many leaders, but none cast a shadow as dark as General Sani Abacha. When he seized power in 1993, he spoke of discipline, reform, and national unity. What followed instead was one of the most corrupt and oppressive regimes in Africa's history. Under Abacha, fear became government policy. Political opponents disappeared. Journalists were jailed. Protests were met with bullets. The world watched in horror as Ken Saro-Wiwa, an environmental activist and writer, was executed. His only crime, speaking for his people. But while silencing dissent, Abacha was also robbing his nation blind. Through a vast web of fake contracts and foreign accounts, he looted an estimated $5 billion from Nigeria's treasury, money meant for schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. To ordinary Nigerians, the 1990s became known as the dark years, a time when voices were muted and hope felt dangerous. When Abacha died suddenly in 1998, the nation didn't mourn, it exhaled. His death was as mysterious as his power. Some called it karma, others divine justice. Decades later, the Abacha loot is still being recovered from hidden bank vaults around the world. A grim reminder that his theft wasn't just of money, but of time, trust, and a nation's future. At number 7, Charles Taylor, Liberia. Few names in modern African history carry as much terror as Charles Taylor. A man who once promised freedom for Liberia would instead plunge an entire region into chaos. Rising to power during Liberia's brutal civil war, Taylor styled himself as a revolutionary, a man fighting corruption and oppression. But behind his rhetoric was a lust for power, diamonds, and domination. His rebel army, the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, became infamous for massacres, rape, and the use of child soldiers. Boys as young as 10 forced to kill or be killed. World soon learned a new phrase, blood diamonds. Taylor funded his wars by trading precious stones for weapons, fueling conflicts not only in Liberia, but also in neighboring Sierra Leone, where atrocities shocked the world, mutilations, burned villages, and families torn apart. By the time he became president in 1997, Liberia was a graveyard of dreams. What followed was even worse: intimidation, looting, and the collapse of the very institutions he once vowed to rebuild. Eventually, his reign ended not through politics, but through justice. Captured and tried, Charles Taylor became the first African head of state convicted of war crimes by an international court. His story is a brutal reminder. Revolutions built on blood never lead to freedom, only to more graves. At number 6, Francisco Macias Nguema, Equatorial Guinea. In a small West African nation blessed with oil and beauty, one man ruled as though he were God himself. Francisco Macias Nguema, the first president of Equatorial Guinea, turned independence into a nightmare. When he took power in 1968, he spoke of national pride and liberation, but soon paranoia consumed him. He began executing opponents, closing schools, and banning newspapers. Then came the madness. He banned the word intellectual, burned books, and replaced teachers with soldiers. Religion was outlawed. Doctors were executed. Even his own relatives were not safe. By the mid-1970s, his rule had become one of the most insane dictatorships in African history. Public executions were held to the sound of music. Entire villages disappeared. More than a third of the country's population fled or were killed. Macias declared himself president for life, but his rule ended as it began, in blood. In 1979, his own nephew, Teodoro Obiang Nguema, led a coup against him. When captured, Macias was found hiding with millions in cash and gold, proof that even in madness, greed remained his compass. He was executed by firing squad the same year. Today, Equatorial Guinea still bears the scars of his reign, a paradise that turned into purgatory under a man who mistook fear for power. At number 5, Robert Mugabe, Zimbabwe. Once celebrated as a liberator, Robert Mugabe began his journey as the face of African pride and resistance. When Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980, Mugabe stood on the podium as a national hero, the man who had freed his people from white minority rule. For a time, hope was real. Education soared, healthcare improved, and the nation thrived. But power changed everything. By the late 1990s, Mugabe's rule had transformed from leadership to tyranny. His violent land reform program, meant to correct colonial injustice, descended into chaos. Productive farms were seized, the economy collapsed, and food shortages gripped the nation. Hyperinflation spiraled so out of control that 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars couldn't buy a loaf of bread. Those who dared to question his authority were beaten, jailed, or disappeared. Elections became rituals of fear, and the same man who once preached freedom became obsessed with staying in power forever. For nearly 4 decades, Mugabe ruled with arrogance and iron will, until his own party finally forced him out in 2017. By then, a country once known as the breadbasket of Africa had become a symbol of despair. Mugabe's story is one of tragedy, how a hero of liberation became a prisoner of his own pride. At number 4, Mobutu Sese Seko, formerly Zaire, now Democratic Republic of Congo. He called himself the father of the nation, but to millions, he was the father of corruption. Mobutu Sese Seko ruled Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, for over 3 decades, turning one of Africa's richest lands into a kingdom of decay. When he seized power in 1965, Mobutu promised stability after years of political chaos. What he delivered instead was a kleptocracy, a government built entirely on theft. While the people of Zaire lived in poverty, Mobutu lived like royalty. He owned multiple palaces, a private airport, fleets of Mercedes-Benz cars, and even a Concorde jet for his personal travel. He demanded loyalty not through love, but through fear and bribery. His face was printed on money, his name on cities, and his image elevated to godlike status. But beneath the spectacle was rot, an economy collapsing, infrastructure crumbling, and citizens surviving through corruption just to eat. By the 1990s, Zaire had become a hollow state, drained by decades of greed. When rebellion finally swept him out of power in 1997, Mobutu fled with an estimated $5 billion, leaving behind a broken nation and the legacy of despair. He died in exile the same year, alone, disgraced, and forgotten by the country he once ruled absolutely. Mobutu didn't just rob Zaire's treasury, he robbed its future. At number 3, Omar al-Bashir, Sudan. In 1989, a little-known military officer named Omar al-Bashir overthrew Sudan's fragile government, promising stability, reform, and a new dawn for his people. What Sudan got instead was 30 years of fear, war, and blood. Under Bashir, Sudan became a land divided, not just by borders, but by hate. He imposed strict Islamist rule, silenced the press, and turned the army into a weapon against his own citizens. But his darkest chapter unfolded in Darfur, where his government launched a brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing that killed more than 300,000 people and displaced millions. Entire villages were burned to the ground. Women were raped, children starved, and survivors forced into desert camps. The world called it genocide, and the International Criminal Court agreed, issuing a warrant for Bashir's arrest in 2009, making him the first sitting head of state indicted for war crimes and genocide. Yet, even as the world condemned him, Bashir clung to power, protected by fear and the military elite. Sudan's economy crumbled under sanctions and corruption, and by the time he was finally overthrown in 2019, the once promising nation was left fractured and unstable. Bashir's reign was a testament to how one man's thirst for control can set a country ablaze, and how justice, no matter how delayed, always comes knocking. At number 2, Idi Amin, Uganda. He called himself the last king of Scotland, but to the world, Idi Amin was known by another name, the Butcher of Uganda. Rising to power in 1971 through a military coup, Amin promised to restore dignity and strength to his people. What followed instead was 8 years of terror that left over 300,000 Ugandans dead. Amin ruled through fear and brutality. His regime carried out mass executions, secret killings, and public torture of anyone who opposed him. Ministers, judges, even soldiers who questioned his orders. His paranoia became legendary. One wrong word could mean death. In 1972, he expelled over 60,000 Asians, mostly business owners who were the backbone of Uganda's economy. Overnight, industries collapsed, stores shut down, and inflation soared. The same man who promised to make Uganda self-reliant had destroyed its economic lifeline. Behind closed doors, Amin lived like a king. Gold medals on his chest, women at his side, and entire villages at his mercy. He declared himself president for life, but history had other plans. By 1979, his own soldiers had turned against him, and Amin fled into exile, first to Libya, then Saudi Arabia, where he lived comfortably until his death in 2003. Even in exile, the ghosts of his victims never stopped haunting his name. Amin's rule remains one of the darkest chapters in African history, proof that power without conscience is the deadliest weapon of all. Finally, at number 1, Muammar Gaddafi, Libya. He called himself a revolutionary, a visionary, even a king of kings of Africa. But to millions, Muammar Gaddafi was the dictator who built an empire on oil, fear, and deception. When Gaddafi seized power in 1969, he was just 27, young, charismatic, and burning with anti-colonial fire. He promised to give Libya back to its people, and for a time, he did. He nationalized oil, funded free education and healthcare, and transformed Libya into one of Africa's wealthiest nations. To outsiders, he looked like a model of success. But beneath that wealth lay a growing shadow. Gaddafi's rule slowly turned into a cult of personality. His face filled billboards, his green book became compulsory reading, and dissent became treason. Opponents vanished without a trace, imprisoned, tortured, or executed. Abroad, he funded rebel movements and terrorist acts that spread chaos across continents. Inside Libya, fear ruled more than law. By the early 2000s, Gaddafi was one of the world's longest-serving dictators, untouchable, unpredictable, and drenched in luxury, while the poor watched in silence. His bizarre speeches, his all-female bodyguards, and his golden palaces became symbols of a man lost in his own myth. When the Arab Spring reached Libya in 2011, decades of silence exploded into rage. His own people rose against him. The world turned its back. And in the dust of Sirte, Gaddafi, once a self-proclaimed god, was dragged from a drainpipe and killed by his own citizens. Libya has never recovered. The empire he built on control collapsed into civil war, and the nation he claimed to love remains divided and scarred. Gaddafi's story is the ultimate tragedy of power, how a liberator became a tyrant, and how a nation's dream turned into a never-ending nightmare. If you watched till the end, thank you. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and never stop questioning those in power.